Okay, it's 11 a.m. Mountain Time. Good morning, Idaho. Also, we have with us today attendees and speakers from Oregon, Kentucky, Illinois, Pennsylvania, New York, Utah, and Wyoming. That much I know. I'm sorry if I missed any of you in any other states. My name is Ruth York, and I'm the Executive Director of the Idaho Federation of Families, or IFF. The staff at IFF is both happy and a bit nervous that we have reached day one of our parent education conference called Yes, You Cans. For anyone new to the Idaho Youth Mental Health System of Care, let me share that Idaho's system goes by the acronym YES for Youth Empowerment Services, and CANS is an acronym for Child and Adolescent Needs and Strengths, which is an assessment that is a foundational part of the YES system. While I make some announcements and acknowledgements, please fill out the poll that we will be displaying briefly momentarily that gives us all an opportunity to know who is with us today. But okay, while you do that, I want to acknowledge that the Idaho Department of Behavioral Health is the sponsor of this conference. Several of their staff are here with us today, and I want to share our thanks for this opportunity to bring knowledgeable speakers together with parents from all over Idaho to understand more about the CANS and how it is intended to impact youth mental health. Okay. I want to offer another shout out to Beacon Health Options, who donated money for us to produce some conference swag, which is actually quite challenging in a virtual world, but I think we've done it. More on that at a later time. Please visit Beacon's vendor table at a break. More on the vendor tables before we take our first vendor break. We have timed this conference to coincide with National Children's Mental Health Awareness Week. Each day of this conference, we will share the artistry of a young person who will share their talents and tell you how they have used their artistry to promote their own mental wellness. So I hope you will join us for that. We also have a youth event planned for this Friday evening and Saturday that we want to make sure you share with any youth and young adults in your lives, ages high school through 25. It will be a series of engaging speakers, activities, and information sharing focused on mental health, mental wellness, personal stories, and the experience of peer support. Thanks to Magellan Healthcare for their full sponsorship and active participation in the planning of this youth event. Magellan is also participating in our parent conference by providing our Friday morning speakers. Please see Magellan's vendor table as well. Final note. During all conference sessions, IFS staff will be monitoring the Zoom chat function and the Whova Q&A, and we'll do our best to get as many of your questions answered as possible. Our speakers have kindly offered to provide answers after the conference to questions we do not have time for during the conference. We can post those to our website, and please know that a recording of all sessions will be posted to our site later in May. We will also make available copies of tip sheets, parent tools, and things that speakers present in their sessions, so there is no need to try and screenshot every screen or write copious notes. I got a preview of the session we're going to go into yesterday, and you're going to drive yourself crazy trying to capture all the amazing material that is being offered, so just know it will be on our website for you. The small but mighty staff at IFF have made this conference happen and will be behind the scenes helping today. They are Michelle Batten, our Family Engagement Coordinator, Nat Perry, our Youth Programs Coordinator and Youth Move Leave and Technology Assist Extraordinaire, and Pat Martell, our Director of Development. Towards the end of the day, we have an exciting announcement to share about a new IFF venture that we will be launching, so please stay tuned for that. Now, on to our speaker introduction for today's session. As I introduce our keynote, I'm going to launch another poll that will start off our first session. So I'm going to go back to that. Okay, I'm ending the first poll. It should be displaying for all to see. Is it on Whova? Oh, no, it's not doing that because I haven't shared it yet, but now I'm sharing it. All right, so we have quite a mix of people. Wonderful. Just welcome to all of you. We're so glad you're here. And now, our second poll. There's a lot of buttons to push to get to the polls, guys. All right, there we go. Launch polling. Excellent. Okay, you'll answer that while I proceed. The topic of today's session is successful treatment planning using the treatment planning pyramid. Dr. Nate Israel is with us from Oregon, where he is the director of the Union Point Group. Union Point has a great description of their work on their website. It is great in both its simplicity and its message. We help systems help people. I really like that. Dr. Israel helps organizations and systems adopt more effective family and youth-driven practices. He consults with states, including Idaho's Department of Health and Welfare, regions, and private agencies to help them become more transparent about the impacts of their work with family and youth. Please read his whole bio in Whova, as it highlights some important past work that I think will be of interest to many of you. Today, Dr. Israel will begin by describing what is known about how assessment translates into treatment planning, quality of treatment planning, agreement on the goals of treatment, and the elements of care that every treatment plan must include. He will then introduce treatment planning, the treatment planning pyramid, which is an easy to use tool for assuring that your understanding of your family's needs and goals determine the care that you receive. You are going to learn how it helps you make sure you consistently have the right supports to meet your goals. If you enjoy this whole conference, you really have Dr. Israel to thank for that, because he was instrumental in helping us define what content and speakers would offer you a valuable experience that we think will impact you far beyond this week. Thank you, Dr. Israel, and I will turn it over to you now.
I appreciate that very gracious introduction. And, you know, I share both the core commitment to making sure that families and youth are really what drive systems, and the idea, I think, that we all experience, which is that this is very hard work. There's no easy way to get from where we are to where we want to be. So what we'll talk about today are some practical steps that we can take while we're working within imperfect systems. And our systems are always going to be a bit imperfect, sometimes more than others. And so here's some ways specifically around treatment planning that we can make sure that what we're hoping for and what the goals that we have really drive the actions that are taken. So with that, we'll jump in to this PowerPoint. I'm going to share my PowerPoint with you here in just a moment.
And Dr. Israel, tell me if you want me to share when you want me to share the polling results. Oh, I think you have control of that, actually.
Do I? Okay. Then we will cross that bridge in just a couple of minutes. Can folks see the screen? See the PowerPoint there?
Yep.
All right, lovely. So what we'll do now, I think this is going to move. Oh, there we go. Okay. So if you've taken a few moments to answer the questions about your most recent experience of treatment planning, then we will jump in just a moment and review those experiences. But before we do that, I want to start by acknowledging the folks here that really the genesis behind this whole idea, of course, is the Federation of Families saying we need something to be able to really get the word out, both to professionals and to families, around how we bridge the gap between what we're hoping happens and what is happening. And Ruth, Michelle, and Pat are just consummate professionals in trying to figure out what's the best way to do this in the most challenging environment possible to put on a conference, which is in the middle of a pandemic across a geographically distributed state where it's very difficult to bring people together. And so I think the idea that they've been able to do that virtually is already a success. As Ruth mentioned, the materials that I'll present today will be on the IFF website. There are a couple of handouts that are specific to this presentation, which we've created in easy to print versions, which will also be available. If there's anything that's missing that you said, you know, I really like slide number 26, I really wish I had that as a handout to take with me, or I really wish I had X, Y, or Z, then just let Ruth, Michelle, and Pat know, and I'm happy to turn anything that you see here into something that you could take away as a one-page sheet to take with you. So just know that. I'll try and be brief about why I got into this. About 15 years ago, I started getting very interested in family and youth directed change. I'm trying to figure out, how do we make family and youth directed change really stick in children's behavioral health systems? And so we looked at a series of other systems. As well, I was faculty at the University of South Florida. We looked at a series of other systems where it looked like they'd been successful in making that change. And what we found is that there's this systems change cycle that happens. And the first is identifying where the system is not working. The second is being really clear about that, and in fact, publicizing it so that you can get people motivated to change that system. But then when you have people motivated to change a system, you have to actually show what it is that you would do differently and why it's better for any change to really take place. And then the system has to support that change, right? You have to get change up and down the line, people behind it and motivated to change in order for that change to stick. Well, one of the things that we realized in this process is that this has to be a continuous process, because big changes in systems can take anywhere from 10 years to 20 years to actually take place and take root. We don't have 10 or 20 years to wait. Our children will have all grown up by that point in time. And so as the system is changing, we have to figure out, well, what are the strategies that we use to make the system as effective as possible while it's going through change. So here's some targets that we really pushed for as a result of the research that we had done. And the first is the idea that we have to decentralize power, and families and youth have to be at the center of operationalizing or defining what is good care. Now, there are two other pieces to that that we identified as absolutely critical. One of them is happening today, so that educating and empowering family members and youth to become agents of change is the whole point, I think, of this conference. The other piece that we have to figure out is to create financial incentives for family-focused innovation. And I think that that's still a ways off for almost every behavioral health system in America. If they were to do that, it would really change the way that providers acted if parents had control of the dollars. That's beyond what we're talking about today, but those were our findings from those early studies. I then went on to the San Francisco Department of Public Health and worked to implement the CANs there beginning in 2018, or oh my gosh, if only it were 2018, beginning in 2008, it's a good 13 years ago. And as we were implementing the CANs, part of what we found is that there was this enormous gap between the intentions of practitioners and the experience of families. Practitioners intended to use a transparent, collaborative, empowering process, but that's not what parents experienced. And so we did over 20 focus groups with family members and youth to really dig down into how families would define collaborative care using the CANs. And this is to use the CANs for screening, for assessment, for treatment planning, to reassess and mark progress in treatment, and then for transition planning. And we built a manual based on that has a series of strategies that systems can use, that providers can use to implement the CANs in a way that's actually collaborative and helps lead to shared goals and the desired outcomes of families. And then we went beyond that. We went and we surveyed families based on the practices that were described in that manual. And we said, to what extent did you experience these collaborative practices? And then we also asked them, how much did your child's functioning change over time? They're functioning at home, in school, and while they're out in the community. And what we found was this very strong relationship between truly collaborative, parent-defined care and improvements in your child's outcome. So the more collaborative providers were, and the closer their practices hewed to what parents said that they wanted, the better the outcomes for kids and families. And so what we know is that truly collaborative processes, truly collaborative care can improve outcomes for kids and families. The question is, how do we make sure that it actually happens? And so today we're going to give you a series of tips for how to advocate for the most appropriate collaborative, empowering experiences possible using the CANs in treatment planning. And we're going to give you some ideas about what are some things to look for. We're also going to show you kind of what the other side thinks, or what providers think is good practice, so that you'll be able to use the terms that providers use when talking with them about what you're experiencing and how it matches up or doesn't match up to what you were hoping for in terms of practices. We'll close with something called the treatment planning pyramid, which is simply a one-page handout that helps you organize your thoughts around treatment planning and very quickly see the extent to which the treatment plan is really empowering you to take the next steps that you're hoping for or not. And then we'll walk through a series of scenarios where you can think about what are some strategies that you could use if things aren't lining up the way that you're hoping for. Just as a bit of context here, here's another system that went through a settlement process, a federal lawsuit, much like Idaho has. And this was the state of Hawaii, which, even though it may seem like it is a paradise to outsiders, actually has some really substantial challenges around meeting the behavioral health concerns of youth and the goals of their families. And what you see on this timeline is that there's about a 10-year gap. 1991 is when the settlement occurs. And then 2002 is when you really see services change. Right? That's more than a decade. You also see about a 6-year gap between when the family organization really started getting involved in systems advocacy there. That's Hawaii Families as Allies. That was between 96 and 98. And then when a slate of more appropriate, a deeper array and more intensive services were really implemented. That's between 99 and 2002. And so in that 6-year gap, families were trying to figure out, how is it that we get the most appropriate services when there's a system that really isn't there yet in terms of providing it? And we think that this is likely similar to the situation that Idaho is in right now. So while your system is trying to develop that appropriate array of services, what we're trying to provide are some tips for how you can advocate for the most appropriate care, even as the system is still growing and developing the appropriate array of services. So that's just a little bit of context there in terms of thinking about how quickly or slowly systems move for change, and then what the implications might be for us as we try and advocate for the most appropriate care. So this is our challenge, right? So what do we do during this multi-year gap? This is a quote that we have from a parent that was involved in some of our focus groups in terms of identifying appropriate care, right? And what she noted is that it's really hard to get what you need if you can't say exactly what you need. But that's supposed to be what professionals are helping you to do, right? So part of what we're trying to do is to help you identify here what are some of the ways that you can pinpoint more clearly what you need so that you can effectively advocate for the help that that would actually help, right? All right, experiences of treatment planning. So let's get into what people have actually experienced. Let's see if I can figure out a way to share this poll. Are people seeing the polling results now?
Yes, we're seeing them, Nate.
All right, so it looks like about half of the time, the CFT Child and Family Team or therapist gave you a copy of your child or youth's goals. Note that that's something that's going to be absolutely essential as you move forward, is asking for and getting that, because that's the basis for identifying what to do next. Did the child and family team or therapist help your youth choose a small number of the highest priority needs to focus on? That's going to be important. We have about 40% of folks who agreed with that, and about 50% of folks who disagreed or strongly agreed with that. That's important because we have to be able to identify just a couple of things that we work on. Otherwise, our efforts are going to be spread too thin, right, across all the things that we're trying to do. Did they help you set goals that were realistic? About half of folks, or just more than half of folks, agreed with that. And we're going to talk about what realistic means. Part of realistic is really thinking about how much effort you have to put in to be able to achieve that goal, and to achieve that goal within the next 90 days, right? So these should be time limited goals. Did they write them in your words or your youth or child's words? Only about half the time, or slightly less than half the time, did people agree that that was happening. It's really critical for the goals to be written in your words so that you can really own them, right? So that they mean something to you. And so it's not just something somebody else is forcing on you. Did they come up with ideas and strategies that were tied to the strengths of your child and family? We have almost 60% of folks who agreed that that they did that. About 40% who said no. We'll talk a bit about how strengths are absolutely critical to being able to meet your goals and to improve functioning over time. Strengths are really the cornerstone of being able to move forward from some of the challenges that we have. And building strengths is one of the most overlooked parts of the treatment planning process that we have. Did they check in often with you to see if therapy was helping you reach your goals? We have the most positive responses here, in that people were, most of the time it looked like, checking in to see if therapy was helping you reach your goals. That's absolutely critical, because treatment should never stand still. It should always be adapted to what's working for you or not working. And then, did they make it easy for you to say when something wasn't working for you or your child? And almost everybody agreed that it was. That's terrific. Okay. So what we have, I think, as you look at the polls, is a pretty mixed bag, in that for most of these practices, you could almost roll the dice. And half the time you get the experiences you wanted, and half the time you get an experience that really wasn't what you wanted. And in fact, that's something, unfortunately, that is all too common. So if we look at other systems in terms of the percentage of parents who indicate that they strongly agree that the professional help them choose a small number of the highest priority needs to focus on, that's about 58%. When you ask youth the same thing, the numbers drop a little bit on that. In terms of setting goals that were realistic, it's a little less than half. Writing the goals in their own words, or your own words, it's a little less than half. helping folks understand how the treatment would actually help them, that drops dramatically. And helping them understand how that would help them and their child, it drops back to about that 50%. Checking in often to see if therapy was helping me reach my goals. About just over a third of folks strongly agreed that that was happening. Checked in often to see if therapy, so the top number there, I'm sorry, was youth, and the next one under it was parents. And again, what we can see is that it's more likely that professionals are going to check in with parents than with youth to see if goals are being reached. And it's also more likely that it's going to be easy or easier for parents to say when something wasn't working than it is for the youth themselves to be able to say that. So it's important for parents who are advocates and are involved to be able to know that, sometimes you might actually be the amplifier of your child's experience, and that they may have even more reservations about talking to the therapist about the treatment planning process and about achieving their goals than you're experiencing, right? But in both cases, those are really those experiences are really much less favorable than we would like them to be. They're not happening at the rate that we would hope for. Which brings us to the question that we're going to spend almost the entirety of the rest of our time on, which is, how is it then that we bridge that gap? How is it that we move from practices that we know should be happening and we want to have happen, that we know are associated with better outcomes, to them actually being commonplace, to them actually being the experience that nearly every parent and every youth has? Well, one of the first things that we can do is we can identify from providers' perspectives what providers believe should be happening in the treatment planning process. So not only did we talk to families when we were doing this work about what they hoped that the practice would be like, we started talking to supervisors, to therapy supervisors, to understand what it is that they said would be important. And then in Idaho, we also have a look at the treatment planning policies that are in place. So when you think about the policies, and then when you think about what therapists say should be happening, that gives us a real clear sense of, from the provider side, what these practices should be. So let's start and take a couple of minutes, and we'll go through Idaho's own treatment planning policies so you know what those are. And then we'll jump into the perspective of providers and what they have indicated is good practice, and then what's not, so that you'll know, even from the provider perspective, when it is that you should be looking to elevate any concerns that you have about the care that you're receiving and about the treatment planning process. So in terms of Idaho's treatment planning processes, these come from the DVH policy 1213, which was instituted in 11/7/2018. There's a whole set of policies there, and they should be accessible to anybody if you dig around on the web long enough. Even though only about half of folks indicated that they were given a copy of the youth's goals, their goals for treatment, it is in policy that the clinician should offer every client, parent, or guardian a copy of the plan. And in fact, all people who participated in the development of that plan are supposed to sign it. Whether or not you receive that treatment plan should also be documented. So you really, there really shouldn't be an instance in which you're not explicitly offered a copy of the plan. So if that doesn't happen, you need to ask for that plan. If the person doesn't provide it, or for some reason refuses to provide it, then please go up the chain at that agency. That should really be an extraordinarily rare occurrence. So the treatment plan, a copy should be automatically offered to you with clearly defined goals, objectives, and interventions when it is completed. So you should both be asked to sign it, and then you should be given a copy of it. In terms of the timelines for completing these plans, 15 days from the date that you've been determined eligible for services, a treatment plan should be completed. That is a tight timeline, but it lets you know that that should be happening almost immediately. So the moment you're determined eligible for services, that provider should be working with you to identify what your goals are, what your child's goals are, and how to achieve those. Now that's 15 calendar days, right? That's not business days. That's not, if we made it business days, it was pushed out to 3 weeks. It's really 2 weeks from the date of the eligibility determination or the date that the court orders treatment services. And then there are 2 other pieces here that are really critical. The policy indicates that there should be 120-day reviews of that treatment plan every 120 days. So every 3 to 4 months, there should be a formal review of that treatment plan. And that is really your opportunity to say these goals are reasonable or unreasonable, or they've already been accomplished. These services are appropriate or inappropriate or no longer match the goals. It also should coincide roughly with when your CANS is updated. So the CANS should be updated. You should see from the CANS, what are the things that you've made progress on? What are the things that need to be addressed now? And then that should translate into the services and the goals that it just says services are called interventions and the goals are typically called objectives on the treatment plan. So you should be getting an opportunity fairly frequently to review how care is working and then to update it. From the get-go, as an advocate, really identifying the moment that first treatment plan is put together and signed off and that you get a copy of it, identifying when the next review will be is really important because that puts the therapist on notice that you want that to be a formal process. You don't want them to simply be looking at the treatment plan after they've completed a session, updating it, and then writing a note that says, oh, there are no changes that need to happen, et cetera, et cetera. You want to make this a process where you're really involved in reviewing that treatment plan, seeing if it still makes sense, seeing if the services are still appropriate, and then updating the things that need to be updated. Otherwise, what happens is you end up getting stuck waiting until this annual renewal of the treatment plan to make substantive changes. So you want to be in on those 120-day reviews. In terms of the implications here, there are a couple of things that are important to keep in mind. One is that if the CANS is an assessment and identifies what are the needs and strengths that need to be acted on, and so the CANS should be completed before any treatment plan update happens, and that lets you see what progress has been made and what things you still need to work on, or what new things have come up that need to be addressed. The other thing that's very interesting here is that psychological treatments, interventions have their greatest effects, about 50 years of research indicating this, within 12 to 16 sessions. That coincides very neatly with 120 days out, right? If you're getting care weekly. So you should be feeling the effects of treatment in terms of improved functioning and reduced symptoms also, and new strengths being developed at that 120-day review. If you're not really experiencing a substantive change there, then something needs to be shifted in terms of the care that you're receiving. So it is important to note that review period really coincides with what the research says the time that it should be taking to be able to feel the effects of care. Right? So those things should be lining up. So goals, this is part of the DBH policy. So their goals, the goal is the broad general statement that expresses what it is that you hope is going to change. It's the overall outcome that you hope to accomplish or change. So really you'd think about this as the thing that you want to accomplish through treatment. What is the functional change that you would like to see occur as a result of treatment, right? And it should be written in positive, they say call it client-centered, which means I statement language, indicating what the youth and or family would like to see happen as a result of care. Now, the nitty-gritty here is this next step. This next step is objectives. So objectives are the incremental short-term changes that are stated in action words. Those objectives should clearly be the things that move you towards the goal. So you might think about objectives as the things that should be accomplished within that 120 days that are going to get you close, clearly closer, measurably closer towards the goal that you're hoping to get to, right? Objectives are supposed to be written in SMART terms. So they've defined SMART here in policy as simple, measurable, that means there should be numbers associated with them, attainable, reasonable, and time limited. Yeah. What most folks do is they set 1-year timelines for the objectives because that's the farthest out that you can go without changing the documentation on your treatment plan. I don't think anybody actually, as a parent or a youth in care, wants to wait a year to see change, right? So if you're advocating for effective care, what you really want to advocate for is that each of these objectives are written in 120-day increments so that the therapist is really thinking, what will I achieve before that 120-day review working with you? And that really helps keep people focused on what it is that they're trying to do in those 12 or 16 sessions where you should be experiencing change in the most profound way. When they say that the objectives should be measurable and achievable, measurable, you typically look for how frequently is it happening now, and how frequently would we hope it to happen at the end of the time period that we're working on this. So today, how many times a week does it happen? Or how many times a day does it happen? A behavior that we don't want to have happen, or a behavior that we're hoping to build on. And then in 120 days, what would we like to see that frequency be? By achievable, what you're really looking for is the effort that we're putting into this consistent with what it's going to take to change it in 120 days. So is meeting once a week or once every other week, or 2 times a week, or getting very intensive treatment, what's actually required to move the needle on this? And that's why frequent check-ins with the therapist are important, because you really can start to say, well, you know, we're meeting this often and it doesn't feel like anything's changing, or we're meeting this often and yeah, it really is working. Let's keep this up, right? So that achievable is really talking about for how much effort in, what are we getting out of it? All right. And I've talked a bit about this. So objectives are the short-term goals you should be able to accomplish by your next treatment plan review. If it can't be accomplished in 90 to 120 days, then it really shouldn't be on that plan. You should really push for these to be things that can be accomplished in 90 to 120 days. It should be really clear how those objectives and meeting the objectives naturally lead to the accomplishment of the big goal. Right? Should be very easy to see that. And if those things aren't easy to see, then the therapist you need to be advocating for the therapist to really work to write objectives that show what are the stepping stones towards meeting that larger goal. This is where rubber meets the road in terms of treatment planning. So interventions or planned services, these are the activities that the team, particularly the therapist, and anybody else that they have involved in care, provide to help the client achieve their goals and objectives. The intervention, as they describe it in the treatment plan, should include these elements: the program name, so the program is going to provide it, what type of service it is, how frequently it's going to be provided, who is it that actually is going to provide it, where they're going to provide it, and how it will be completed. That is really getting clarity around that is going to be helpful to you, because then you can say, you know what, we're getting this, once a week. It's written out in the service in the plan as are being able to get it once a week. And that's really not the frequency that's working for us at the 90 to 120 day review. Or in the plan, it says we'll get this once a week, and yet we're only getting it every second or third week. It's not coming through for us for some reason. We have to figure out what's a way to get it more frequently, right? Having things down on that treatment plan is absolutely critical to being able to advocate for appropriate care. So this interventions piece is a big part of kind of the heart and soul of what you can advocate for in terms of getting appropriate care for your child or family. Right now, in Idaho, there's a continuum of care gap. So there are services at the very highest level of intensity. There are services that are traditional outpatient weekly sessions or biweekly sessions even is more frequent. But intensity in the middle there, that it might be when you need services 2 or 3 times a week for your youth, things like that. Those are very infrequently provided right now. So being able to indicate that a frequency of service is not working for you, it's not helping you or your child meet their goals, is really important to help them push the system along in terms of developing those more intensive services, authorizing those more intensive services, and getting what you might need for your youth or family. And really having that on that treatment plan document is critical. The timeframes, those expected achievement dates for objectives or overall goals can't be later than 12 months, but you should really be pressing for the objectives to be written in those 90 to 120 day increments, as opposed to 12-month increments. Otherwise, there's no accountability in the meantime. Okay, so that's the policy side of things. I just want to check in terms of time here. All right. Then we have provider-defined competencies. What provider-defined competencies let us do is let us see the provider perspective on how treatment planning should be happening. And then it allows us as advocates to use the language of providers to be able to bring it up to a supervisor or program director to say, I had this experience and it really wasn't what I was hoping for. Is there a way to change that? Right. So this. So what providers have said is highly competent treatment planning are these behaviors, is that the therapist is able to work with families to come up with multiple appropriate goals and specific objectives. So you can really clarify what are the things that you're working towards. Those are things that you as families and youth really care about and think are relevant. That they're actually things that you want to work on. So they're able to elicit motivation and commitment to work on those goals. You're able to say what are the things that you would do to achieve those goals. It feels like that's something that's important to do to you. They're also able to elicit what it would be like if things weren't changing, right? And this is a motivation strategy, right? So they should be able to say, well, if this does work and we are able to change this, what would it look like? And if things just stayed the way that they were today, this is what that would look like too. Oh, we don't want that. So let's move towards this other piece, right? A good clinician should be able to really elicit both sides of that. You should leave that process with a sense that these are goals that you own, that matter to you, and that you want to work on. And then you should also be able to leave that process with a sense of the hierarchy of goals, that these are the things that are most critical. You're going to prioritize these because they're most closely linked to the outcomes that matter to you, right? Or because they're the things that are absolutely the most pressing and have to be taken care of before you can do anything else, right? So you should have a clear sense of what are the priorities, why are you doing it, what's it going to change, right? And you should also experience that these are your goals. They matter to you. Okay, so if that's happening, then per providers, that's the best case scenario in terms of treatment planning. That's really what a competent therapist would be doing. This next set of behaviors that we're going to describe are what providers themselves indicate occur when there's this is an imperfect process that likely we should still move forward, right? So you would proceed with caution around these. And a provider like this would be able to come up with one or more coherent goals, goals that make sense to you and that relate to the presenting issue. They should be goals that you have ownership of, but you might not internalize all of them, so you might not be able to remember all of them. And you might leave with the sense that, yes, they really did listen to you, but the way the goals were written is a bit more formal than the way that you would have written them. Right? So it's just these, this is a imperfect but good enough scenario, right? Where you can still move forward. There's still goals that get to what it is that you're trying to do. It doesn't feel exactly like the way that you would have done it, right? Or the way that you would have written things. And generally on both sides, we can still proceed. Although you want to make sure that things don't stray from what you're really hoping for, right? And this is why these check-ins and reviews are going to be really important, especially if you're feeling that yellow light scenario. Red light. These are behaviors that providers themselves, supervisors, long-term supervisors, have indicated that if a therapist is engaging with you in the treatment planning process in this way, that you need to find a way to slow down or stop the process, to bring a supervisor or program director in to really say, look, this is not what we're hoping for around treatment planning. This is not what we're doing. If the goal doesn't relate well to what your presenting issues are, right? That's a very first indicator that something is off. If you can't understand what the goals are or why they're being created, what's the rationale for them, or you feel like it's something that the therapist came up with and they're imposing it on you, if you don't have buy-in and understanding of those goals, then you should not be proceeding. If you feel like they aren't things that you are motivated to do, or they're inappropriate for you to be doing, that's another indicator that you need to stop the process. If the goals feel like they are culturally a strong mismatch for you, or that they don't line up with the developmental progress of your child. So they're beyond what it is that they're capable of doing, then again, that's a sign that the process is not proceeding as it should. If you're being overwhelmed by the number of goals that are listed there, that's also important to note. If the goals only target one environment, but the need is present in multiple environments, that's also an indicator that something important is off. So for instance, if the behavior is happening both at home and at school, and yet there's nothing in the treatment plan about addressing it at school, that's a warning sign. That's an indication that the clinician is not really understanding the totality of the behavior and how to address it. If the clinician can't understand the difference between a goal, an objective, and an intervention, the goal is the big thing that you're working towards, the objectives are the things that are helping get you there, and the interventions are the services that help move you along that pathway, or can't clarify for you how the interventions are designed to support you in meeting those objectives, which help you meet your goal. So if it's really not clear what is being provided as a support to you to help you meet these intermediate goals that help you get to the functioning that you really care about for your child, if that is not crystal clear, then you need to stop the process, because it may not even be clear in the therapist's head, right? If they can't communicate it to you, it might indicate there's some work that they haven't done on their own to make that really coherent and logical. And so that's a great indication that, hey, it is time to stop things and then to elevate it to the supervisor, to the program director, if they're not willing to revisit it with you and work through it until it is understandable. All right. And once again, these are definitions that are provided by supervisors themselves, right? So these are people within the profession saying this is what our profession should do. So using these, this set of language should be a language that's easy for providers to understand. All right. So if you find yourself in that sticky situation, what are some ways to stop things, to ask, and to elevate? Well, almost every state has a regulation indicating that people who are not fully licensed as independent practitioners are required to disclose that on their first meeting with you. They're also required to tell you who their supervisor is and how to contact them. So immediately, if you hear the word intern, if you hear somebody say, I'm getting my hours towards licensure, any of those sorts of things, I would immediately ask that, I'd say that's fantastic. It's great to hear that. It's a pleasure to work with you. Who is your supervisor? How can I meet that person, right? Because you want a relationship with the supervisor. They typically have to sign off on important elements of care. They have to co-sign a fair amount of these documents. And so they have a legal responsibility around this care. And so it's important that you meet them because the buck may stop with them. In agencies, particularly larger agencies, there's also a program manager or a clinical director. So many times you may have fully licensed clinicians and they're not clinically supervised technically by somebody else because they could operate as independent practitioners. But usually, if it's a decent sized agency, there's a manager who's responsible for that program or set of clinicians, or a clinical director, or there's the owner of the agency, right? And so figuring out who the person is that you would communicate with if things are not moving in the appropriate way with the therapist is really, really important to get early on, right? It's just to figure out who that point of contact is in that process. When something isn't clear, the first thing that I would do is to slow the process down. So ask for it to be explained to you more clearly. You could ask for people to write it out in simple to use language. The treatment planning pyramid is all about you being able to prompt the provider to explain what it is that they're providing. And so when we get to that, that's a one-page document that allows you to see how these things are being organized on the treatment plan and whether or not they make sense, right? You can also ask for documentation, and there is recent federal legislation that has just blown this wide open. You are allowed to access all assessments, treatment plans, and progress notes per federal regulation now. Federal regulation supersedes any state regulations. So anything short of handwritten notes that clinicians have that interpreted the session, those are clinicians, they can always keep that. Anything that they've used to describe care or the care process that they then bill for, you have a right to get it, and you have a right to get it free of charge. If you start asking for those sorts of things, I guarantee you that will be noticed, and that can slow down the process, so that you can figure out what's happening and where to go next. As a matter of course, as somebody receiving treatment, I would always ask for the assessments. I would always ask for a copy of the care plans, so that you have that basic documentation. But if you get to the point where things really aren't working and you're trying to understand what's going on, you may even want to ask for the progress notes. They might also call them billing notes. And federal legislation has indicated that actually you have a right to receive those documents free of charge. That will slow the process down. And get things noticed. I wouldn't do that immediately, but it is something in your quiver should you need it. All right. Treatment planning essentials. So where is everything that you need, and how can you find it? I just want to check in on us time-wise. Are we going to 12 or 12:30 before we take a break? Sorry.
We're going to take an actual break by 12:45.
Okay.
So anytime we break before that is added time, and also question and answer time.
Okay. Thanks. So we'll need, all right. So treatment planning essentials and where to find them. There are three essentials that are absolutely critical in your treatment plan. So you need to be able to see what level of care was authorized. You need to be able to understand what the clinical focus of care is, and you need to be able to see what strengths are going to be developed. These three things are absolutely critical because they set up what it is that you can receive in terms of supports, what people are going to work on in terms of addressing or ameliorating in terms of the clinical focus, and then how they help you move forward, which is about developing strengths. So we'll go through each one of these. The level of care sets the expectations for the intensity and coordination of treatment. Now, when we say level of care, people often confuse that with the setting of treatment. So for instance, somebody might say, well, it's a hospital level of care. Well, that's not really a level of care, that's a setting of care. Hospital is a setting, an office is a setting, your home is a setting, right? But a level of care, what we're really talking about is the frequency and the intensity of care that's provided. And higher levels of care typically enable you access to more frequent, more intensive care. So, instead of getting care for 45 minutes every other week, you might be able to get care for 2 or 3 days a week, 2 or 3 hours at a time, right, at a higher level of care. So that's what we're talking about in terms of the level. If you qualify for a higher level of care, it enables access to additional types of formal care, which, as we know, Idaho is still developing. It might also enable access to non-traditional care or supports, or it might enable your access to formal coordination of care. So it might be they have to, if care is identified as complex, then they would have to provide care coordination that moves across different systems or different providers to make sure that care isn't at odds with each other, isn't duplicated, and is actually helpful. That's the idea behind wraparound and targeted care coordination, is that there are likely multiple providers or multiple systems involved. And so you want to be able to make sure you have similar goals that folks are working towards across providers and systems, even though you have different interventions that are provided by those providers and systems to reach them. You can find your level of care on the completed CANs. So once the clinician enters that CANs online into the ICANS system, in the background, it compares all of the items that were rated to an algorithm that it has that then identifies what level of care, intensity of care you've qualified for. And then it prints that right out. So it computes that level of care based on the CANs ratings and prints that out at the end of the completed CANs. So if you ask for your copy of the CANs, and this is a screenshot right down here where it says recommended level of care, I've literally copied this from a de-identified CANs assessment. And it literally will show levels 0, 1, 2, or 3 as your level of care. And the higher level of care, as you might guess, provides the expectation that there will be more intensive services and better coordinated services as you move up those numbers. Right? So before you start any treatment planning, always request a copy of your completed CANs, because it will tell you the recommended level of care, which is set up some expectations for the frequency and intensity of services that they'll be noting and providing per the interventions section of your treatment plan. There's additional information about how ratings on the CANs lead to a level of care recommendation. So if you go to this link right here, there's a couple page PDF that walks through how those algorithms are built. I wasn't able to find Idaho's algorithm for level of care on any publicly available sites. Other states literally will put the algorithm up there so you can see exactly what CANs items and ratings lead to what levels of care. The algorithms are meant to be open. They're meant to be public. I can say that because I've designed them, many of them for many states. And it's not intended to be a secret process. It's intended to say, you know, if you have these needs and this level of need or risk, you should be getting more intensive care. So I know Washington State has their algorithm publicly provided on their WISE website. I worked with them for quite a while. And I'm not sure exactly where it is in terms of yes, but those are the one difference between the CANs and many other instruments is that's not designed as a proprietary or secret or hidden algorithm. So even if you look at Washington's algorithm, it's going to be fairly similar to Idaho's. So that shouldn't be a secret. Although I didn't immediately see Optum's. Yes, and I know that there are Optum clinical guidelines. It's an interesting bit of a weird situation in that that Optum has their own tool that they indicate using. But yes, which is legally mandated to be the level of care determination system, uses the CANS. So you should not have an experience where your level of care is indicated as 2 or 3 on the CANS, and then you get some sort of Optum decision that you don't qualify for those services. That should not be happening. If it does, I would that's the point. I would involve the Federation of Families and anyone else at that point. All right, we're a little off target here. Just keep that in mind. All right, level of care. The implications for you. So, one of the first things that I would do if I was working with a provider and I got my CANS assessment and it has the level of care, I ask for what the services are that are available at that level of care on your CANS. And I would also ask, what's the frequency of care that can be provided at that level, right? So that it's both at the forefront of your mind and at the forefront of their mind as they're starting to work through this, so that people are really on the same page about where this is at. This level of care, clinical focus. So clinical focus starts to get more technical. So the clinical focus is really supposed to be about the primary diagnosis or the underlying cause for the functional impairment that your child is experiencing. As clinicians, we typically talk about a clinical formulation, which is supposed to be at the end of any diagnostic assessment, which is a description of what causes and sustains the primary diagnosis, or whatever the core concern is, that presenting problem, people typically call it, that someone shows up with. There is a legal standard associated with this. This is very recent. This was a court decision in a case called Witt versus United Behavioral Health. You might be familiar with UBH. And what the judge found there is that it's a generally accepted standard of care that effective treatment requires treatment of the individual's underlying condition and is not limited to the alleviation of the individual's current symptoms. And what that means is that the focus of care should be on addressing the things that cause these symptoms to keep recurring. It's not just enough to say, well, we address those symptoms. We need to be able to say, we address the things that cause the symptoms. And that is really critical, because there are all sorts of ways in which you could manage to reduce a particular symptom. But if you're not addressing the cause of it, then long-term, you're really not much better than when you started, right? And so what we really are saying is, well, what's the way to address this core issue that's creating these symptoms, right? So how are we addressing depression, or how are we addressing anxiety that's being manifested in all these different ways? And the Federation of Families has posted a workbook that I believe the National Federation put together, and then that Idaho has done some work customizing for Idaho. Is that the right characterization? I want to make sure we're giving credit where credit is due. So they have a family and youth workbook, which is really a terrific piece of work. And as you're going through there on the family version of that on page 7, it asked about diagnoses that you have been provided for your child, who provided it, when it was provided, those sorts of things. The diagnosis is a good starting point for thinking about what your clinical focus is. What is it that you're really going to hone in on as you're working together? on the completed cans, it identifies what the primary mental health diagnosis is, and if there are any other secondary or tertiary diagnoses that would also be addressed. So you should be able to see the most current primary diagnosis that they're using to authorize services right there on the cans. The CANS is not a diagnostic instrument, so the CANS is not asking about a series of symptoms that would then produce a diagnosis for folks, but your CANS ratings should be consistent with the diagnosis that's being provided. So what does that mean? Well, if you look at the definition of the CANS items, and what I've done here on the left-hand side is pull out all the CANS items from the behavioral and emotional needs section, and that's the section that has items that relate to diagnostic categories or potential diagnoses on the CANS. Anytime something is a 2 or a 3 in terms of an item on that section, then it likely should be associated with a similar diagnosis. So for instance, the adjustment to trauma item, if that's rated a 2 or a 3, then you might expect that a primary or secondary or tertiary diagnosis would be post-traumatic stress disorder or something in that family of disorders. And then this just walks through kind of each one of those items and crosswalks them for you with what it looks like is the diagnosis or set of diagnoses that might be there in the DSM-5, right? So for instance, if there was a 2 or a 3 on psychosis or thought disorder on the CANS, then you would look to see if there was a diagnosis of something on the schizophrenia spectrum or any other psychotic or thought disorders from the DSM-5. If there's an attention or concentration rating of 2 or 3, then you might look to see if there's a primary or secondary or tertiary diagnosis of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Also, impulsivity might include an ADHD diagnosis, but you might also look at mania or impulse control disorders, and they may be your primary diagnoses. So this just walks through or crosswalks what CANS items might be associated with different diagnoses. If you have a primary diagnosis and yet the CANS item that would seem to be associated with it is not rated a 2 or a 3, then that should be a bit of a red light to you. You should be asking the clinician, well, why wasn't this rated a 2 or a 3 on the CANS, right? Because they might not be linking together what that assessment found and what their diagnosis is. And that's a bit of a problem. In fact, part of the reason that could be a problem is if they're underrating the CANS items, then you're not likely to qualify for the appropriate level of care that you should be receiving, right? So you want to make sure that those things line up. All right. All right, and you can see these crosswalks here that continue. And don't worry about writing these things down because you can get a copy of this. But almost all of these CANS items crosswalk pretty easily and have pretty similar names to the diagnoses that might be associated with them. Now, a more difficult problem comes up when it looks like there are multiple diagnoses or multiple actionable items on the behavioral and emotional needs section. So what do you do when the assessment is finished and, hey, it turns out that there's a whole series of items in the behavioral and emotional needs section on the CANS that are rated 2s or 3s, which indicates they would benefit from treatment, or you have multiple diagnoses that have been provided. What do you actually do about that? How do you manage that? Well, one of the ways to do that is to start to think about these items in different buckets. So most broadly speaking, there are two large classes of disorders that can be identified in the CANS behavioral and emotional needs section, and that are identified really in almost any diagnostic system that we use. So the broadest bucket is thinking about things as externalizing problems, which present as acting out behavior, and internalizing problems, which largely present as internally focused symptoms, those thoughts and moods that a person is having that aren't immediately apparent to the people outside. Now, they might present as irritability, in which case you can kind of see this like change in mood and touchiness about things. But generally, internalizing problems they're called invisible problems many times, and it's harder to see that they're there immediately. We also see two other classes of concerns that jump up in the CANS, so substance use concerns, and then reality distortion. So psychosis and eating disturbances both involve fairly serious disturbances in the way that one is interpreting their self and their behavior and the environment around them. So if you start to see several things that have been identified as actionable items or diagnoses, and you're thinking, well, how can we deal with all of these things? One way is to see, do they cluster into these categories? And if they start to cluster into these categories, then they should have common ways of being treated, largely. And so externalizing problems are going to be treated by identifying what are ways to reduce some of these behaviors and put appropriate replacement behaviors in place. These internalizing problems that we're going to work on are the thoughts and ruminations that consistently trigger them or keep them going, and then the ways to replace those behaviors and those concerns and that physiology with different ones. What is the number beside those those labels relate to? The number beside those labels are something that that we found in our research that would indicate that it's a very severe case. So if you were to add together the CANS ratings on these items, if you add it together across those 4 items on the externalizing dimension, and you totaled to an 8 or higher, then you have a very serious externalizing concern, and it warrants immediate and focused treatment around it. If internalizing, it's also associated with higher rates of aggressive and self-harming behaviors, and that's true for the internalizing section 2, paradoxically enough. So the internalizing, if you add together the CANS ratings of those 3 items and it totals higher than 6 or higher, that's a very severe case of internalizing concerns, and it denotes a need to address that intensively. So that's what the numbers are beside those. So let's just go through a brief exercise on making sense of these patterns. So these are the CANS items from behavioral emotional needs section. If we were to look at this right here, we'd identify that this is an actionable concern. So this is something rated a 2 or a 3, and then be over there. It should be over. Sorry. This is, or sometimes PowerPoint doesn't work in my favor. This should be over here on depression. Depression and adjustment to trauma should be the ones that are outlined. As we can see from our previous slide, what we would say is that those are internalizing concerns. And so we would want somebody who can work with addressing these internalizing concerns. If we had a more complex pattern that we see here, here we have, those are internalizing concerns. Here we have a pattern of clear externalizing concerns, right? Emotional, physical regulation, oppositional behavior, and conduct are all rated 2, meaning that they all would benefit from treatment. But then we see over here that adjustment to trauma is also rated a 2. So if we're trying to put together a treatment plan with this particular pattern of needs that had been identified, we would want to ask ourselves, is adjustment to trauma related? Might it be a cause or a symptom of these other concerns? So maybe something happened with this child, and in fact, it is not only creating PTSD-like symptoms, but it's also creating these symptoms that look like dysregulation, opposition to authority figures, and then what is rule-breaking behavior and potentially malicious behavior. Are they related to each other? So might adjustment to trauma be the root cause of these? Or might this be something where we need to identify what the priority is? Maybe the priority is addressing this cluster of externalizing problems, and then to move on to address the adjustment to trauma. We would work with the therapist to do that, and then to put that down on the treatment plan. But instead of having 4 different things that we're working on at the same time, we can see that there's one cluster of 3 externalizing concerns, and then there's this adjustment to trauma concern. And so it may only be that there are 2 things that we're focusing on in treatment. And so we just have to sequence those 2 things as opposed to trying to sequence 4 different things. So it's a way to try and make sense of a fairly complex situation. All right. Strengths. So we've talked about things in a fairly traditional clinical sense up until now, but the research is very clear and the results keep getting repeated, that strength development is actually absolutely critical to functional improvement over time. And that's what we really care about, right? Is we really care about how well kids can do at home, in school, and in the community. And if we are developing strengths, then that really is setting us on the path to being successful at home, in school, and in the community. And so we're seeing more and more research indicating that not just having strengths, but developing strengths is critically important in behavioral health care. These are data from another public behavioral health system. I did this work with Dr. Sarah Akamatsu, a wonderful researcher who went on to work for a treatment agency. And what we found there was very curious and eye-opening to us. So the first thing that we found was, if over the course of 6 months of treatment, strengths decreased, so you had a lower number of strengths for that child, symptoms increased. We found that if strengths weren't developed as on average in the course of treatment, that symptoms didn't improve. And then we found that if there was a focus on developing strengths, and strengths were developed, that symptoms improved more quickly than for any other group, right? And for every other group, the symptoms basically didn't improve, they just got worse. So strength development and symptom improvement actually go hand in hand, and it's important that there's a focus on both. So even though we might focus on diagnoses and clinical concerns, part of the way that we address things is by saying, what is it that you want to become, and how do we help develop that? In fact, there's been a ton of research about what that looks like. In the workbook that's available online, the Idaho Federation of Families, they talk about both the goals that you would like to achieve and the things that are amazing about your child, the strengths that your family has, the people that your child likes to be around, spend time with, and the things that they like to develop, right? All of those things are critical to developing positive functioning. And this is really central to the clinical enterprise, even though it's been overlooked substantially in the past. And so when people say, I want to identify a child's strengths, we have to say that there's a next step that you have to take with that too. It's not enough just to identify what a child's strengths are. The next step is to actually develop those strengths. And when we talk about them, there are really two big clusters of strengths. And so I'm using the framework that's been developed by the Search Institute. So these are well-researched and validated strengths that have been shown to help youth grow up in ways that they say here are healthy, caring, and responsible, right? So exactly what we're hoping for. And they divide strengths into two kind of mega clusters. One are external assets. This is the environment that's provided for a child to succeed. And so they talk about the supports that they have, how that child is empowered, how there are appropriate boundaries and expectations that are used to help the child to identify what are appropriate and inappropriate behaviors, and then constructive use of time. So how their time is channeled into things that will help them develop in a healthy way. And you'll notice there are 20 different items there that identify what are these external assets or strengths that can be put in place or are in place for your youth to help them be successful. And then there's a second set of these, which are internal assets. So again, we have another 20 items. It includes things about being successful educationally, having values that are meaningful and interpersonally helpful, socially, how to get along with others and build helpful relationships, and then having an internalized sense of self that is that's caring, responsible, and future oriented. Right? So what is that positive identity? And these are really the types of things, these two sets of assets are the things that we should really be working to develop, because they help a child whether or not they're receiving formal support services, therapy, or other services or not. These are the things that help them be successful in the community and can carry on even beyond formal services and the end of formal treatment. And we know that they actually help motivate young people to be involved in treatment. So one of the, when we were doing focus groups with youth, one of the things the youth said is they get really tired about how people, therapists in particular, are always focused on their past and what they've done wrong. And they're much more interested in what they can become and how they're going to get there, right? And thinking about these strengths or assets is a way to help move people from saying, oh, the past is really not where we want to be stuck. We don't really want to be doing the kinds of things that got us in trouble before, or relating to people in a way that caused problems. What we want to do is to figure out how you can become the person you want to be. And this is really about shifting that framework towards a much more positive frame. And in fact, it's actually much more effective as a frame for treatment. So really looking to see on that treatment plan, how are strengths being developed? And if somebody says, I don't know what strengths are, then this is a very substantial list of them. Now, You can also crosswalk these with the cans items. And so what I've done here is I've just offered a crosswalk with these cans items that make some of this explicit, right? So if it turns out, you know, the youth is struggling with, oh my gosh, with externalizing, for that might be a warning to me, with externalizing concerns, you might think about developing strengths around peer influences, the use of their free time, how they're developing interpersonal strengths to positively relate with other people, and then their family support. In parentheses there are the crosswalked items or clusters from the developmental assets sheet that I just showed you. So if you're using that to say, well, what's the bigger set of things that we could work from, and then how does it translate into a cans item? This will help you do that. You know, if there's internalizing concerns that a person is struggling with, then some of the things that we would hope that they would be developing are a sense of the future that's positive, so that's optimism, their own talents and interests, things that they care about and want to do, a sense of connectedness to their community and engagement in that community, and also a way to have positive social interactions with other people that are rewarding to them and not anxiety provoking. So those are, you know, strengths that that map onto these clusters of concerns. You can also see sets of strengths there that are associated with substance use and reality testing. So these are just some things that you would likely want to explore and make sure that the therapist is exploring as you're thinking about what your treatment plan objectives are as they're moving forward. All right. This is the place where I had hoped that we would take a break before jumping into more. I think people have been very, very patient with all this information. So Ruth, do you have thoughts on what we should do? If we should just make this an extended break or take questions, or
well,
I'm open to
I think an extended break is excellent, and but we do have two questions I'd like to see if I can articulate successfully enough for you to answer. One is very straightforward. Somebody asked if you could get to slide 51 quickly enough. Is that easy to go back to?
I'll try.
The clinical focus table of issues.
Yeah.
The bucket next to each. So what does the number next to each bucket correlate to?
Yeah. So if you look at so let's look at the CANS right here. So this is the CANS behavioral and emotional needs section. So if you look at these items, so if you took the externalizing items, oppositional behavior, anger control, impulsivity, and conduct. So if you literally just added together the numbers associated with those 4 items, and it was 8 or higher, that means that actually you have very severe externalizing concerns, and it's associated with if it's not effectively treated, it's associated with worse outcomes, things we get very concerned about. So if you look at those 4 items, you add them up together, it's 8 or higher, then you really need somebody who knows how to address externalizing concerns. You should be receiving intensive supports around that. It really is like a clarion call that this needs to be addressed. Same thing with internalizing those 3 items. If they add to 6 or more, if you have substance abuse is just 1 item. So if your substance abuse item is 3, then you definitely need somebody who's a substance use expert, and then the reality disturbances too. So.
Okay, that's great. Then at the very beginning of your talk, where you were citing, or early in the talk, DBH policies.
Yeah.
The 1213, as I remember. The question came up, but are private providers bound by these policies of DBH, which we were able to answer, no, they are not. But we wondered if you could comment on that. We further shared some information when asked whether Optum had a crosswalk to match between the DBH policies and their services. And we do not know the exact answer to that, though we provided some information on the clinical guidelines that Optum does have, and that we know that their contract, and we have Optum members with us today who could pipe into the chat, their contract does, of course, require them to create services that adhere to the DBH policies. But kind of to that issue of, but then you have a private provider actually doing these services. And so what happens when a parent feels caught between the fact that that provider is not adhering to the policy or intention of the service?
Absolutely. Yep. That's a huge problem. And in fact, if I were going to be quite dour and pessimistic, I would say that it many times appears that systems are designed to keep people from being accountable. And the more structures you put in place, the easier it is to avoid accountability. Now, there is actually a very clear way to move away from that, and that is to publicly and transparently indicate what your timeline standards are for every process and care, and what the expected performance is around that, and to put that in contract language. And that's one thing that we keep recommending to every state that we work with. In fact, some states have done a good job of that. Some counties or regions, when they do that. So part of right now people are stuck going up multiple different chains where it's unclear who ultimately is accountable for it. But I will say the structure of things per Medicaid federally, Medicaid says that the state is responsible for care. It doesn't matter who they contract it out to. So the state is ultimately the one who is responsible. So if providers are consistently providing care that is not consistent with policies that are put in place by the state is the one who's ultimately responsible for that, even if they contract it out. So I would keep that in mind in terms of the formal way that gets run up the chain and how the state addresses that. That tends to be a state-by-state process. And I want to be careful because I don't have expertise around the complaints process in Idaho. Although you should also note that one of the things that they indicated in the remedy to their lawsuit is that they would clarify the complaints process. So what you can ask any agency is, if you have a problem with services, what's your complaints process? And they need to have that in place and be able to provide that to you. And that should provide you actually with a line to the state. So you should be able to see how that moves up the chain like that. That's a requirement of their settlement agreement. So.
Okay, thank you. And related to that, and we're going to do one final question, and then I'm going to take us into a break. Can you speak to what if both externalizing and internalizing are the highest?
Yeah, what if they're both like equally high and there are lots of them? Yeah, the first thing that tells you is you need intensive care, that you really should be receiving intensive supports. Often it says that there are some pretty serious things that have gone unaddressed for a fairly long period of time, right? Which is why things seem very diffuse. The other thing clinically that I would think about as a psychologist is that what you want to do is to identify potentially what is either the concern that seems most treatable to start with. So what is something that you can make some gains on? Or it could be, what is the thing that's causing the very most disruption? So what's keeping this child from being able to function? And so identifying which of those is kind of your priority, and then moving forward with that. is important. Right? There are some cases where, especially with young and very young children, one starts to look like the other. So like extreme, like depression might come out as anger control problems for very young kids because they don't have the words for depression. So it could be that one is masking the other or is the expression of the other. But in any case, what you want to try and do is to identify what you're going to focus on first. So what provides you the most positive benefit to work through first. Work through that. It typically has gains around the other symptoms and concerns too. And then as you're doing that and make progress on that, then move sequentially into the other. And you really have to, helping the therapist recognize that that's important to do is really critical. What we found is that therapists many times don't maintain the focus from one session to another, and that doesn't allow you to get depth around any particular issue. So once you do decide what it is that you're working on, really sticking with the idea of let's work on this is critical.
Thank you. That really hits home for me because I've certainly had that experience of we don't follow something through in therapy. And I think it is quite detrimental. Dr. Israel, thank you so much for this morning's presentation.